Okay, good morning, Jules.
Good morning, Diego.
Good morning to everyone. We have Jules Coleman here with us in Girona. Thanks a lot for coming, for attending the conference, and for accepting to have the interview. Jules Coleman is a professor at the New York University, philosophy professor.
Yes.
And he's vice provost.
Yes.
Since recently, right?
Yes, since April.
Since April. The first thing I'd like to ask you is about your background, your family, what did your parents do, your origins, where you were raised, in which way?
I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, primarily. My father was a baseball player, and eventually became a grocer in the supermarket business. And I had two brothers, both younger than I am. We lived in a very small apartment in Brooklyn. When I was younger, we moved around a great deal in the basic same neighborhood. But we lived in very modest housing all the time. And for the longest period of time, we lived in a 4-room apartment with three of us in one bathroom. My brothers and I had beds adjacent to one another, and my parents were in the other room, and the bathroom also was served where my mother used to dry the laundry. And we lived in the middle of a block of attached houses where there were apartments on one floor, and the second floor, and we lived on the bottom floor. So we actually lived right above the heating system called the boiler room that heated the whole neighborhood, the whole block. And behind us was the garbage dumpster, where everyone would throw their garbage at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day. And we moved to that particular apartment because it was the least expensive in the whole neighborhood. So we lived in very modest means, but we didn't really see it that way. We didn't realize that we were poor because everybody in my neighborhood was poor, and we all did the same things. We would play out on the streets, and it didn't matter whether you were from a wealthy neighborhood or a poor neighborhood, everybody played on the streets. And so we went to public schools, and most of what we did, certainly most of what I did, was go to my public school, and then in the afternoon I would play sports in the schoolyard, then come home for dinner, and then go play basketball at night in the gym. Those were the days when the schools used to be open for after-school activities for many, many hours. So we had lots of friends in the neighborhood, and none of us knew we were poor. The funniest thing about growing up in this way was because my father worked in supermarkets and grocery stores, he used to get discounts if he would bring back all the dented canned goods that had dents in them because they couldn't sell them, or if the label came off. So we had a whole collection in our kitchen of dented cans and cans without labels. So we never knew what was inside them, and we couldn't stack them up because they were all dented in different ways. And my parents were complicated people and loving but very naive about the world, and they gave us some interesting lessons, which was something like the following: that you should do extremely well in school. You should get A's, because if you get B's or C's, you have to remember that people don't like Jewish people, and they will do anything that they can to screw you. So the only way you can make it hard for them to screw you is to make sure that you do so well that they can't screw you. But remarkably, people can screw you no matter how well you do.
They managed to do it anyway.
Yeah, so that was a basic theme of our growing up. Another theme of our growing up was my factor was that my father got cancer and became very sick. And I moved, my parents sent me to live with my uncle, my father's brother. And my father and his brother never really talked to each other. They were not close. In fact, my father's brother had a lot of gambling debts. And he was a very outgoing fellow. And my father had to quit high school to pay for his brother's gambling debts. Because his brother was the older brother and his parents favored him and made my father pay off his debts by working. So my father, who was actually very smart and a terrific athlete, had to finish high school at night, not during the day. And we never really knew this. When we found out all these things about my father after he died.
He died young?
No, he had a very slow-growing but virulent cancer. It attacked the area that it attacked and wiped it out, but it did it very slowly over a long period of time. So he lost his leg, and he first had many artificial hips put in, and he had one of the earliest artificial hips. And so he was out of the house a lot in the hospital for long periods of time. So when I went to live with my uncle, he had no interest in me at all. So he would leave me at...
Did you went alone or with your brothers?
Just with me, because I was the oldest, and my parents felt that I needed some guidance. And I went to live with my uncle outside of Philadelphia for a year. And my uncle, who had no interest in me, he had two daughters, would just leave me at the golf course. He was very wealthy. He ended up being wealthy. And he belonged to a golf course, and that's when I became a caddy and learned how to play golf. And then I returned to Brooklyn, and I was the only person I knew who played golf in Brooklyn. So it was, so I was certainly the best golfer I knew for a long period of time. But I actually had a lifelong interest in playing golf, and it began there, as strange though it may be. Now, my parents were also the children of immigrants, and we were very close to our grandparents. Not emotionally close, we just lived geographically close. But they didn't speak English well, and we had a certain distance from them.
From where did they
Russia,
come from?
mostly.
Russia.
Russia, and on my mother's side, on my father's side, I believe Poland. So we were also Orthodox Jews. So we took our religious training seriously up to a point. We used to have play games in the sense that we were required to go to Hebrew school on Saturdays, Hebrew services. On Saturday, we had to flip a card over to prove that we were there. And we would get gifts at the end of the year if you were there enough times. But of course, you're not supposed to do anything athletic, but we would go there on Saturday in our baseball uniforms. We were in the Little League, which would make everybody crazy because it was obvious that we were going to go play baseball immediately afterwards. And we would also, some of us would turn over our friends' cards, and so that people would get the benefit of the gifts without ever showing up. But I was actually a good student in this regard, and my family my grandfather had picked me out to become the family rabbi, because in every somewhat religious family, someone is picked out as the future rabbi. My older cousin, I thought, should be picked out, but he was a baseball player also, and he was an outstanding athlete, and I was the only person who looked like an intellectual. So I became the family rabbi to be. Now, that meant when I went to Hebrew school, I did quite well, And when I was bar mitzvahed, I led the whole service by myself instead of the rabbi. I did the whole thing for 3 hours. And my family was very proud. And within 1 year, I was an atheist. So,
what happened?
well, I thought, you know, this is crazy. But, you know, I was a great believer in the ritual, but I was always a very questioning and skeptical person. And within 1 year of, after my Hebrew graduation of my bar mitzvah, my skepticism took over.
In a sense, it's not that the practice, I don't know much about rabbis, but it's not critical reflection on the Talmud.
There's critical reflection as long as you believe.
That was the point.
Yeah, yeah. But you're not supposed to be so critical. You're supposed to be questioning and finding answers. And I was questioning and not finding answers. And I was a believer in science all along, though I wasn't sure what that meant. And so that was, my basic upbringing was in a neighborhood where most people were Jewish or Italian, very few African Americans. Most of the African Americans I knew was when I played sports, especially basketball. We had a very narrow vision. So, for example, we used to refer to Manhattan as the city, as if being in Brooklyn was not being part of New York City. The city was Manhattan, and we used to look at it longingly, wanting to be there. But I was close with my brothers. It's interesting, my middle brother is 3 years younger than me, and he skipped from the 2nd grade to the 4th grade, and from the 7th grade to the 9th grade. So he was the most advanced of all of us. And in my case, I skipped from the 7th to the 9th grade. I didn't go to the 8th grade. And my younger brother went to every grade, sometimes more than once. He always describes himself when he went to college as majoring in LSD. He went to many different colleges and finished none of them. But he did a nice tour of all the colleges. And he ended up being a professional writer. So he's a very successful and distinguished writer. And so his education had no impact, apparently.
That's Reed you're talking about.
My brother Reed, yes, yeah. And my brother David has been in middle management in various industries his whole life. So we grew, the people who were closest to me were my family members and my cousins and so on. And so we lived a neurotic life. We were very closely bunched in this apartment, so there were very few healthy boundaries between us. There was virtually no privacy. It was very noisy. The standard form of communication was screaming at one another. That's how you knew somebody loved you, I guess. And but we really didn't know any other way. So in retrospect, it was not ideal, but I can't say that I experienced it that way. To me, it was just the way you grow up. And I was the only real intellectual in my family, counting my cousins and everybody. I don't really know how that began. I only know much later that my father was very, very intellectual. He read an enormous amount. He was defeated by life. He was unable to achieve the things he wanted to, and then he got very sick. And I think he always harbored resentment for the way his life went. And he never shared that fact with us in conversation. He didn't offer advice or didn't explain how his life had gone. And the only way we saw it was how he treated us. So he was often yelled and hit us, and he was sad. And one of my regrets in life was I couldn't distinguish his sadness and it was too personal. It was too detrimental to me. He was too oppressive and too bitter and too angry for me to get beyond it and see that really it was all sadness and disappointment. And it took me a long time to mature in my own life. And because of that, I could not have been the help to him and appreciate him and improve our relationship until it was too late because he had already died. By the time I was mature enough to appreciate the pain that he had gone through, I think all of us appreciated the physical pain, but not many of us really, my brothers and I, didn't really appreciate the emotional pain. And we learned so many things after he died. So when he died, we would look through his closets, and we found books, memorabilia of when he was younger. And among the things we discovered was that when he was in junior high school, he was not only the best athlete in his school, but he was voted the president of the student body. And this was inconceivable to my brothers and me because, of course, the president of the student body is always a popularity contest. And we couldn't picture my father being popular with anybody because all we pictured was angry and bitter. So it just made us tremendously sad that there must have been a point in his life where he went from being a happy, confident, successful person to feeling very embittered and sad and defeated. And we had never known that. Well, we had never known he had all these successes interpersonally when he was younger, because all we knew of him was that he was angry and bitter and yelling. And my mother used to tell us and give us a very strange message, which was something like, your father is unsuccessful. You know, he's just a grocer, he just works in a supermarket. Don't be like your father. And it's very hard for three boys to grow up with a negative message, don't be like somebody, rather than identify with your father. So it led to very complicated feelings. So since I associate, it was very interesting in the impact it had on me and my middle brother, but the way I see it, I don't know if my middle brother sees it this way. But I took the message, don't be like your father, to mean do anything you can to succeed. And I think my middle brother took the message to be do everything you can to make sure you don't fail. And those are two different messages. Those are two different interpretations of the same message. So my middle brother became very risk averse, and I became very risk taking.
In which way you think yourself as, you think about yourself as risk taking person?
In the sense that ambitious for achievement and success. And because my father had no real friends, doing whatever I could always to make people like me. And because my mother always felt so completely defeated by life and wronged by my father, the people I was attracted to my whole life, with rare exceptions, were people who were very needy and needed to be saved or helped or fixed or improved, because I could never do that with my mother. I couldn't fix it and make it better, but the temptation to do that was overwhelmingly powerful, and I was drawn to conceive of my own success in terms of, did I help people who were in need, and did I get from them the love and affection and so on. So I put those two things together, my father's need to be lots of extraordinarily positive impacts in my life because I have been, I think, a very successful mentor of people and supporter of people and of the profession. And it also has had a variety of negative things because I also found myself interpersonally attracted to needy people, which is, you know, not always the best thing in the world. So, you know, it's been a complicated life in that regard. And the older you get, the more you learn about yourself. It's not always positive, but you get a chance to redeem yourself and change and grow and make amends for your mistakes and move on. So, you know, in that regard, life has been extremely interesting to me, for me. And I also feel extremely lucky because I knew all sorts of people who worked as hard as I did in school. Some worked harder, many of whom were as smart or smarter than I was. But, you know, there's just a matter of good fortune about whether or not your skills match with what people want at different times. Whether you work on problems that people are interested in.
Yeah, timing. Timing is essential.
Timing and luck, yeah.
But before going to that, because
Yeah.
I think where you're going, how was when you finished high school, and you had to decide, because your father and your mother told you had to get all A's.
Right.
In order to do something, most people would say, in order to be a lawyer, in order to be an accountant, in order to be a politician, I don't know
Right.
why, but choose philosophy.
Yeah. Well,
So,
I didn't know when I left high school. I went.
I mean, that's risk taking in a way. Risk taking, as you said, in a way, is not the best way to achieve success.
Right. Well, when I left high school, I went to college, which was like going to high school because it was in Brooklyn. So I lived at home most of the time I was in college. And I was in a variety of advanced programs. And I had no idea what I was really going to do at the time. I think my parents wanted me to be a lawyer or a doctor. So the Jewish picture was you're either a lawyer or a doctor. That's the highest level of success. And then if you can't be a lawyer or a doctor, you're an accountant or a dentist. So an accountant is one step below being a lawyer, and a dentist is one step below being. And my parents had this very strong desire, just don't work with your hands, work with your mind. So no direction, there was really no direction. But when I was in school, I took a lot of different kinds of courses, and I did pretty well, obviously. But the courses that I liked the most were the analytic courses, the idea courses, the argument courses. So they were the theoretical courses. So I was best in mathematics and physics, economics, and philosophy. And I found certain barriers. So I remember doing very well in mathematics until we moved to very advanced levels of mathematics, and I realized I had certain limitations. Physics the same. I was unsure what my limitations were, but I assumed that since I had some limitations in mathematics, I probably have limitations in physics. It was also the period when the Vietnam War was starting. So people were trying to find careers that would prevent them, keep them from having to go to war. And so that meant a lot of people became teachers in the schools, public schools. But I did not see that. But then there were certain graduate schools you could go to which you would be free of the draft. So if you went to medical school, you'd be free of the draft. So I applied to medical school, to graduate school in physics, and to law school, and to philosophy. And I eliminated medical school because I hated the sight of blood. Couldn't stand it. couldn't stand pain. So I couldn't stand pain, I couldn't stand blood. So medical school was out. Physics, my love for science was not, it was not abiding and deep. I didn't go to bed at night thinking about it, you know. Much of it had to do with cosmology and questions about the origin of the universe, and so they were close to my feelings about religion, you know. But the things that were most attractive to me were law and philosophy, because of, strangely, law because of its coercion and authority, the idea of authority and power and control and feeling diminished and vulnerable was a very powerful, because you feel that in religion, right? And
But with law, it was supposed to be the opposite. You have to be protected by law, not repressed. What's going on at the moment?
yes,
So
but if you're politically liberal and left-wing, as I was certainly at that point, you see the law as an instrument of evil and an instrument of power and control, and holds people down and suppresses them as much as it liberates them. So it was that, and that complicated feeling is the way I think most people feel about religion. It's mysterious, it's powerful, it's a source of liberation on the one hand, but it's also a source of control and make you feel bad all the time. Since I was prone to feeling bad almost all the time anyway, that was the appeal of law for me. The appeal of philosophy was questions, skepticism, uncertainty, and that the real ambition was to somehow understand the natural world and your place within it. So a person who feels unanchored, which I felt. Philosophy is very powerful because it says you can anchor yourself if you can come to understand yourself and your place in the natural world. It's accessible to you. So that was the opposite of religion. It was the same questions with a different expectation. In religion it was, in order for you to be anchored, you have to connect yourself to something beyond yourself that you don't fully understand, but you're supposed to have a personal relationship with, you know, a God. And that the explanation is ultimately a matter of faith and not a matter of something that you come rationally to comprehend. And the thought behind philosophy was, you're approaching the same kinds of questions, but the ambition, the goal, the aspiration is to be anchored by self-understanding and by understanding the universe, and that we're capable of doing that through the exercise of our rational thought and our engagement with the world around us. So it felt more personal, more promising, and just as deep and mysterious as religion. And then, of course, for me, ultimately, to jump ahead just briefly, you know, they came together in philosophy of law, right? Where the philosophical questions that you end up being interested in are the ones about the nature of authority, and responsibility, and guilt, and punishment.
But at the same time, you get, I think, following your work, that you get interested in two different fields. One was jurisprudence, and the nature of law, nature of theory, and all those things. Right. But the other was rational choice, law and economics.
Right.
At your beginning, maybe yes, not at your beginning, but at your beginning you could say you make a major contributions to that field, law and economics. There was a discussion going on there about wealth, about efficiency, the value of efficiency, and there you make strong contributions, and also to political philosophy at the same time.
Yes.
They were in parallel. So what happened at the philosophy school? Who were your main influences in all those respects? Because you must have more than one.
I have many influences. So I will say that I learned a lot about why I chose what I chose to work on much later in life. I didn't reflect on why I was working on what I was working on at the time I was working on it. These just were the problems that struck me as interesting, and I didn't reflect as to why I found them particularly interesting. So I'll start with the most important influence on me in what I ended up working on is, of course, as you probably know, the most perverse, which was my mother. Because my relationship with my mother, at the end of the day, explains my interest in corrective justice. And that was an insight after years of psychoanalysis. And then when it came to me, it didn't come to me in a session in therapy, it just came to me in the following way. My mother convinced me that she had suffered wrongful losses. She could have married a doctor, she was a beautiful woman, she married my father let her down, he caused her to be much worse off than she was otherwise. But he was blameless for having done it. That is, it's not as if he intended to do it or was reckless or careless. He suffered his own setbacks in life, and those setbacks in life had negative consequences for how my mother's life went. Now my mother, of course, felt that she had been wrong and that needed to be redressed, and the losses that she suffered had to be responded to in a certain way. And that fact that there were these losses that had to be responded to was not connected. It wasn't just bad luck, it was partially bad luck, and there was a way in which they came about through someone else's behavior who might have had a responsibility to her to make her life better, namely my father. That's what marriages are about. But the duty, the burden to make her better was not my father's responsibility because he was blameworthy for it. It was just the state of the world that my mother had that called for some form of remedial relief. And that question was, who was in the best position to provide that relief? And that was the annulment theory. Right? So I wasn't interested in praise and blame. I was interested in misfortune, in bad luck. And then I was interested in the different kinds of bad luck. The kind you bring on yourself, the kind that nature creates, and the kind that's owed to human agency in a variety of different kinds of ways, whether culpable or not. And then I was interested in the question of who had a responsibility to make it better. That is, what kind of reason did this negative suffering create? And on whom did it create a reason? Who would it be appropriate to respond to? And there, I felt, well, you know, the reason for responding to it is not necessarily connected to the idea of who caused it. It might be connected to the idea of who's in a particularly good position to do something about it. And so that not only became my interest in corrective justice, it became what most people associated me with at the beginning, the annulment view. That the real focus of justice is the loss and its causal structure, but that's a separate question from the question of who has reason to do something about it. So that's where the corrective justice part came from, amazingly, right? And of course it came from the idea that I was in a better position than my father to do something about it. And so I spent most of my life trying to rectify wrongful losses. I'm sure I've done my share of creating wrongful losses, but I've also done more than most in trying to rectify them, both mine and others. You know, someone has been broken because they've had bad luck in life, and I view it naturally as as if there's something I can do about it, I should do something about it. And that's been my theme, as you know, in my life, in my actual life. You know, and of course, like other people, I've made mistakes, and I've no doubt created as many wrong colossus as I've tried to rectify that I am not responsible for. But so that's where that came from. So in some incredibly odd way, my mother was the most influential person on my thinking. I'm sure she was unaware of this. In terms of academic influence, you know, the person who made me interested in philosophy is a person who I would probably have had, I would say, we have no similarities at all. And that was a philosopher in my undergraduate education named Paul Taylor. He's a good philosopher and a very straight-laced guy. He wore plaid sport coats with, you know, these things. And he lived out in Princeton Junction. He would come into Brooklyn every day on the train. He's a very Protestant-seeming, thin, angular, just warm enough to do business, but not warm enough to love and attention and so on. And he taught me the value of good argumentation, clarity and precision, and he moved me forward. He gave me a lot of positive attention and told me I had talent. Then I had a teacher named Michael Bales, who was a young philosopher of law, also at Brooklyn College, and sadly ultimately killed himself years later. But was a very substantial person, wrote a lot of papers, and he made me feel that it could be fun to do this, as well as there were certain ways of doing it. And then there was, as an undergraduate, I also had Paul Edwards, who was the original editor of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Macmillan Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And he gave me a feel at that time for ordinary language philosophy and the relationship of world and language in a certain way. And that was, then I had all these students who were students at Brooklyn College when I was a student, who were influential because we were, you know, philosophers, a very odd group of people in college. And many of them went on to become professional philosophers, and many more than at an average school. It was terrific. But then I went to graduate school, first at the University of Michigan. And there I went to study ethics. And the leading people in ethics then were Franklin, Stevenson, and Brandt, you know, three of the greats. But they were all older or near death, and they didn't really teach. The only person who taught was Brandt, and he taught a course on utilitarianism, which I took. And what we did was read an early draft of Rawls' Theory of Justice, which hadn't been published. The only thing that we read were the sections on utilitarianism.
And what year was that?
1969, 68, 69. And then I became very close to two philosophers of science. Remember, I was a physics person, and Jaguan Kim and Larry Sklar. And they were both philosophers of science. They were fantastic teachers. Fantastic teachers. They got me tremendously interested in philosophy of science. And then for a variety of personal reasons, I wanted to move back to New York. And they wrote on my behalf to go to Rockefeller University, where I was going to do philosophy of science. Because it was Rockefeller University, famous science place. And then when I went there, there was only one person who did philosophy of science, namely a young man named John Ehrman, who was really a terrific philosopher of physics. But there were a lot of people who did political philosophy and legal philosophy, which is not why I went. So when I took my philosophy of physics course with John Ehrman, all these philosophers of science from the New York area also were there, professors, and one other student named David Malaman, who's a philosopher of physics now. And I realized that it was a struggle for me to follow the arguments, which I could do with a lot of work, but that I had no contribution to make. And that no matter how technically competent I was never going to be as good as any of these people were in philosophy or science. So I moved into the ethics people, the social and political philosophy people, which there were more of, and there weren't that many students who were interested in. And that's when I met Joel Feinberg, Donald Davidson, and Robert Nozick. So the first person I worked with was Nozick, who at the end of the year was going to leave to go to Harvard. And I liked him a lot because he was very clever, and he smiled a lot, and he was the youngest person. And so we had a natural bond. And we had a natural bond because I had technical skills that most people in ethics and political philosophy did not have. But, and of course, he did his PhD dissertation on Newcomb's problem in decision theory. And he was extremely influential on me for a variety of reasons. One is he was honest, which is always hard to get. He was supportive. And he pulled me aside one time, and he said to me something which had the biggest influence on how I've chosen to go in my career. He said, you know, Jules, both you and I are interested in these technical problems, in game and decision theory. But no matter how good we are, we will always just be consumers. We'll never be producers. And the thing you should learn how to do is to take the skills you have in those areas, and you know, the expression was not available in arbitrage. Use those skills in areas to work on more traditional problems, because you'll have a skill in working on those traditional problems that other people don't have. And that was the source of my interest in irrational choice, because it was, you know, game and decision theory is part of, broadly speaking, rational choice theory. And what I did was apply it to a range of problems in political philosophy. And then, but not in law and economics. I wasn't applying it in law and economics, but in political philosophy, rational choice political philosophy. Now, I'll go to Joel Feinberg. Joel Feinberg was the nicest man at Rockefeller University, by far. And he was always, would say to you when he criticized you, I'm just playing devil's advocate. He would never say, I really believe that you stink, or you're terrible, or this argument is no good, or anything like that. I'm just playing devil's advocate. So he would always make you feel better about your own incompetence. But you know, deep down inside you always knew it. You knew it. You knew it. So I think he was just uncomfortable being critical. But when it came time for me to write my dissertation, I wanted to work on the theory of punishment, like everybody else. And he said, no, you don't do that, because you know, at that time, criminal law theory was at its peak. Then it died down for a long period of time, and it's come up again. And that's the way things go in philosophy. But at that point, you know, people had worked on the problems in very familiar ways, and they were getting the most out of it they could get out of it. And he said, you're not going to really add much to this. You should work on this other problem. And he gave me Guido Calabrese's The Cost of Accidents, which had just been published. Asked me to read it. So I read it. It's very hard to read because the syntax is terrible. But the arguments were fascinating. And the ideas were fascinating. And then Feinberg arranged for me to take a course on tort theory at NYU Law School while I was a graduate student, which I did. I sat in. And then I thought, okay, I'll write my dissertation on this. So still no law and economics, right? Still no foundations of law and economics work. So there was the rational choice political philosophy, and then there was the cost of accidents. And I wrote my dissertation on basically the question whether or not justice required that liability be based on fault. So it was an analysis of the notion of fault, and it was analysis of what principles of justice require, if any, require fault. So I worked primarily on distributive justice and retributive justice, and argued that neither one of them required. This set me on my path to to ask the question, neither one of them require that liability to be based on fault. Why don't we get rid of tort law, right? We could impose liability in some other way. So at that time I started learning a lot about insurance and all these things, and economics, and I was really taken up by the economics approach to thinking about things. And I thought that torts was about accidents, and I thought that torts was about allocating costs, and the only question was whether appropriate principles for allocating costs. So my mother was in the background of corrective justice, not yet in my work. Rational choice was in the background in my work in political theory. This was a separate. And in time, they all came together, right? They came together, I won't say accidentally, but they came together, you know, coincidentally. I mean, there was no one event that brought them together.
But you met some people at this course on torts, right? Some other people devoting their efforts to law and economics?
No, when I went to Yale.
Not at that first
not
course?
Not at NYU, no. When I went to Yale Law School.
And
how
many years before that was?
That was 4 more years.
4 more years later.
I went to Yale Law School, and in my class, I had Calabresi for torts. And in my class was Mitch Polinsky, the law and economics person, who at that time was teaching at Harvard. And he was influential on me because he was a very technically competent and very precise person. He made clear what was going on, as was a fellow named Rob Pritchard, who became the dean of Toronto Law School and then became president of the University of Toronto. And he was a law and economics person, so the culture of law and economics became infused in me. But the key thing that brought my rational choice political philosophy issues to law and economics was something else altogether. And that was, I read an article, and I don't remember the exact date, in the Philosophy of Public Affairs by Edwin Baker on the foundations of law and economics, claiming that it was an ideology. And this became a very popular paper. It has no staying power. No one refers to it now, but it was very influential at the time. And I read this, and I rarely have this feeling. I read this and I said, this is not a particularly good paper. I can see why philosophers like it, because it says the other side is wrong, and it's ideological. And I said, you know, I could do a lot better than this. And that's something I rarely say. And then I started thinking, well, why can I do a lot better? Well, because I know all the things that the economists know. I don't know the depth that they know, but I know the foundational issues in economics. And I could offer a criticism of law and economics from the inside, not some
external criticism.
External criticism that says, you know, it's all ideological and so on. I should devote myself, because I have these skills, to thinking about law and economics from the inside. And that's when I wrote all the papers on efficiency, auction, and exchange, and wealth maximization. And these became very well-regarded papers. But they were not about law and economics of torts. They're about the foundations of law and economics. And you see the rational choice political philosophy and the foundations of law and economics. Those two parts are the first part of risks and wrongs.
And first part is your political theory.
Right. But they were also essays independently in Markets, Morals, and the Law, because there was one on voting. There were several on voting and rational choice, one with John Fairjohn, the ones on unanimity, and all of those, the ones on David Gautier, rational choice and moral philosophy and bargaining. So there were all those things which were part and parcel of my life at that time. And then there were the foundations of law and economics and the foundations of rational choice political philosophy.
In that book you also have the
one on jurisprudence, the first jurisprudence article.
Negative
and
positivism.
Right.
So
where that comes to mind, right?
It doesn't fit that body.
No. So here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. So that's the story about, so the torts part, let me finish the torts part first. So the torts part was, I I was still in the grips of the law and economics way of thinking about it, accidents and costs. I just thought, well, you know, they're wrong. You know, we can get rid of tort law. And that's when my mother reappeared on the corrective justice side, because I said, well, you know, there's this other principle, which is the principle having to do with, you know, absorbing a certain kind of loss. And then I asked the question, well, maybe tort law has something to do with that principle, and would that require us to keep tort law? And what's its relation to tort law? So then, once I had that, you know, I didn't have the bilateral criticism yet.
Mm-hmm.
That came later.
88.
88, when I reviewed the Chevelle book.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have that criticism. I had this view of corrective justice. So I was working out those ideas. I was working out the political philosophy ideas, and I was working out the foundations of law and economics ideas. Those were the main features of my life. And in Risks and Wrongs was the first time, I think, in a sustained way I put them all together. So as you notice, I really wasn't thinking too much about methodology yet. I was not reflecting upon methodology. I was just working on substantive problems, and I wasn't thinking about my approach to the problems. That came much later. So I was just thinking about these three different kinds of issues and the ways in which they could be connected. And then it dawned on me, I had a way of connecting them, and that way of connecting them became Risks and Wrongs. Okay? And the substance was development of each one of those at different stages of their development. And the question is, where did jurisprudence come in this, right? So the thing is, I had no jurisprudence teacher. I had literally no jurisprudence teacher. Joel Feinberg was not really interested in jurisprudence, and no one else at Rockefeller University was interested in jurisprudence, and no one else I really knew was interested in jurisprudence. But when I was at Rockefeller, I did hear some lectures from Ronald Dworkin on jurisprudence, which I thought were fascinating.
What year was that?
Probably around 1969.
Also in this.
Yeah. And he had just moved to Oxford from Yale. And I thought, well, those are real, you know, I didn't grasp the subjects, but the fundamental question about understanding a certain kind of practice, the focus that he had at the time was that legal positivism has the view that, you know, this is a kind of closed-in practice that has a set of rules that define it, and all the moves that are legitimate to make are made by the rules that define the practice in some way. And his view was that that's not true, that law is not like that. You know, that some of the moves which are legitimate moves to make.
Principles.
Yes, they're not part of the rules that, they're not determined by the rules.
The
idea of pedigree, and that they weren't determined by the laws that, the rules that were constitutive of the practice. The legitimate moves within the practice were broader, that the inside-outside distinction was artificial. You know, so I'm using my own terms to express it. And I thought, well, all that's interesting, but I have no idea what I would do, right? But of course, when I became a professor, I was teach philosophy of law, and that required I read H.L.A. Hart. So I used to read H.L.A. Hart, and I was always thinking about Dworkin's views about H.L.A. Hart. And I, you know, started to read more broadly, read a little Raz, not that much Raz. I read a little Raz. I read, you know, Kelsen. I read some of the older works, the important work. And I had ill-formed views, very ill-formed views. And I would teach my course, and I'm sure I was a competent teacher, but I had no deep insights. And then in 1977, I was asked to be a professor in the Jurisprudence and Social Policy program at Berkeley. So I went there, and the California Law Review asked me to write a review of Taking Rights Seriously. And so I read Taking Rights Seriously. And I thought, well, what would be an interesting review? I thought the most interesting review I could write would be, how would Hart respond to Dworkin? And since I had been teaching Hart, I had some thoughts about it, and I wrote which I think was a pretty good review. It certainly did not make Dworkin happy.
He didn't like it.
No, he hated it. He wrote me a very nasty letter about it, which I didn't understand. It made me cry. I mean, I was very young. I was under 30 years old, and I was very upset. I didn't want to feel like I had let somebody down and misrepresented their views. I gave my review to lots of other people to read, and I sent to those people his criticism of me. He sent me a telegram criticizing me, Dworkin did, and sent me a long letter, and I just was flustered. I didn't know how to respond to him. I thought we had a good relationship, and I actually liked him. It was very,
You had a personal relationship?
No, who knows personal? We met at Rockefeller, and we met a couple of times thereafter at events, and I always had the greatest admiration for him. And I thought he was filled with these incredible ideas, and I just thought part of what I learned in philosophy was the thing you want to do is challenge people. If you have something that you think is worthwhile, find out if you have something there. See if you can move the ball along. See if you can deepen the problems or the answers to the problems, and find your own place. And I was in the midst of just trying to find my own place and self-identify, and this was it. I never met Hart at the time, and I don't think I had actually even met Raz at the time. But I had these ideas. And then, as is well known, I developed these ideas afterwards. Well, I still published my review.
So he read the review before you published it?
Yes, because I've always been a principled person in this regard.
You sent it to him first?
I sent it to him first, yeah, of course.
And after his reaction?
It was very negative.
Yes, and after that you realized that? It made you feel bad. So
terrible.
But you decided to publish anyway?
Yes, because
why?
I got confirmation from other people.
That's why you sent to other people?
Yeah, I sent to other people. They said,
I thought that it was the next post confirmation. Like it was already published.
No.
Okay.
No, I did it
was
before.
Ex ante.
Yeah, I did everything before. And then I published it, and I was very hesitant. I was proud to have a good publication. I didn't know what my career trajectory would look like. I had no idea. I was just happy to have a good job. And certainly at that point in my life, I thought that most of my work would be on tort theory or whatever.
That's why it didn't make sense to make enemies with some subject that might be just circumstantial.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't know, it would always be part of my teaching, but I never thought it would be. And so then I realized that actually I could develop the thoughts that were in my review in a more sustained way. And that became negative and positive positivism. And then I published that, and that got an enormous amount of attention. Enormous amount of attention from Hart. And
liked it.
Loved it from other people, and I only found that out not from Hart directly. I found that out from Will Wallachau, who told me that he was Hart's last PhD student, a DPhil student at Oxford, and wanted to write a dissertation. And when he was in the proposal stage, Hart gave him negative and positive positivism and told him, if you can add anything to this, you can write a dissertation. So that was, I only found that out much later. Then I found out from other people like Raz, who I got to know during this period. I got invited to Oxford a couple of times. I met Hart.
When you met Hart? After
in the 80s, early 80s.
The 80s, so
yeah.
Late 80s?
Early 80s.
Early, so...
No, maybe 84.
Just before publishing Negative and Positive Positivism?
No, right after, so whenever that was. When did I publish that?
I think 81, 80,
Yeah.
81.
Yeah,
82,
so-
82.
Yeah, so it was mid-80s I met Hart.
Okay, 2 years later.
And then one more time, a couple of times before his death. He was extremely nice to me. Last time I met him, it was right after he'd had a bicycle accident and so on. And, but to be perfectly honest, all I thought I was doing was trying to articulate the position that was already in the concept of law. I didn't think I was adding anything. I just thought it was all there. And then, you know, it became a subject. People wrote about it, and I became more engaged in it. And and then people started calling it something, you know, inclusive legal positivism. It's not what I called it. I called it incorporation, but it doesn't matter. And then, so it became a thing. And then it became a question of it's a kind of positivism, and it's sort of its own kind of positivism. You have to defend it. Now, the truth is, for me, I was defending it as a perfectly plausible position in logical space that might actually be true. I wasn't defending it as it is true. This is the view. This is the right view. I was always trying to meet objections. So I got the objections of the Dworkinians and the Razians, right, who thought it was not a plausible position. So then I had to meet those responses. It was very defensive work. I don't mean in a negative way, I mean in a positive way, that it was basically trying to show, no, those objections don't carry the day. There are ways to meet them, and the more ways there were to meet them, the more plausible I found the thesis. But my form of attachment to it was never like my form of attachment to corrective justice, or...
But I think that for a long time, your work on torts and legal theory might be methodologically inconsistent, because you keep saying that inclusive legal positivism or positivist approach, conceptual analysis and everything, is a plausible theory
about the nature of law.
About the nature of law. But when it comes to get to understand tort law, for example, that it's part of law, you apply the constructive interpretation of tort law. Right. So it was, in a way, inconsistent. Why is to capture the nature of law a good methodology, the positivist approach, but when it comes to understand tort law, you can only get to grasp the nature of tort law if you make a constructive interpretation. That means that it's not value-free as the other project.
Well, I don't think any of them are really value-free, but I understand the point. The point is whether a positivist theory of law is compatible with the substantive moral theory of a particular area of the law.
Yeah, it also gets resolved in the practice of principles, I think.
Yes.
Then you get your things more aligned. You go in, this is the same project because now you are making conceptual analysis too when it comes to torts.
Right.
So it is plausible to say inclusive legal positivism is a plausible view of the nature of law, and to say at the same time that you can grasp the essence of the nature of tort law by making conceptual analysis too.
Right,
so
seeing that there are norms that are actually involved.
Yeah, it's embodiment, the idea of...
Right. But you know, the funny thing is, I wasn't focusing on my methodological, whether there was a methodological consistency or not. I always thought there was an obvious methodological consistency, which I never delved any further into, which was this. There are two different kinds of questions. What makes the most sense out of the prevailing institutions of tort law that we have? And there, it might be that the only thing that makes the most sense out of them are ideas that invoke something normatively attractive. And that's one kind of question. Another question is, what's the nature of the distinctive kind of practice that law is? And there, the idea is something about, you know, perhaps something about rules, their relationships to one another, and so on. And so one is about the nature of law, wherever there is law and wherever there could be law, and the other is about the nature of the law we happen to have here. So
one is local, you say.
So one is about, you know, a particular body of law that tends to show up, and the other is about what a distinctive kind of way of regulating human affairs, generally. And I thought that was enough, and if you actually just look at it, with very rare exceptions, most of the positivists, other than, say, Raz, because he doesn't write much on substantive bodies of law, people like John Gardner, myself, we're all moralists about substantive areas of law and positivists about law generally. Never thought of them as inconsistent. But, you know, I didn't really turn my attention to methodological issues at all in a sustained way until the practice of principle. And there I took
the practice of principle very careful. You
I-
took very carefully
I was much more attentive to
the practice of principle. You talk about instrumentalism, formalism.
Right.
You analyze that's a set, right? Instrumentalism,
Right.
and you have another pair, the pair of top-down theory,
And
middle-level
middle-level,
theory.
right.
That one could translate it, I think, into internal point of view, the middle-level theory, and one is an external point of view. You take some principles and go down to the practice, and that's.
Right.
And also you talk about constructive interpretation. So I think that it's very difficult to understand the methodology of rights and wrongs.
Right.
On the contrary, the methodology and the practice of principle is quite clear.
Yeah, and it's much better than the actual argument
Really.
of the practice of principle. In any case, yeah. So that I think those are all fair. I only became self-consciously interested in methodology much later. And of course, the article, The Architecture of Jurisprudence,
The latest.
yeah, one of the later articles, is also very self-conscious about methodology. So I become interested in methodology of legal philosophy. I think that's what happens. You know, you work on a lot of problems, and then you start to ask yourself, okay, how is it that I think about the problems I'm doing? Yeah, you don't have to do that, but I just found myself interested in that, and that why am I drawn to approaching problems in a certain kind of way and attacking them in a certain kind of way? You know, so someone like Brian Leiber, that is his fundamental interest, is what are the available forms of methodology for doing certain kinds of work, and he's very skeptical about the things that many of us employ in favor of other approaches. So he approached the substantive questions primarily through methodological interests, and many of the rest of us have just approached the substantive questions with whatever methodology we were trained in, not actually having reflected on the limitations or the strengths.
I think that's true, and one difference between continental tradition or jurisprudence and Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence is that we are positivists in very different senses. We're positivists because we adopt a certain approach. You're positivist because your substantive theory of law allows the participant to identify law without making moral judgments. The case Shapiro, for example. That's what makes the theory positivist. That the very participant can identify the law without making moral judgments. But that's irrelevant for a methodological positivist that just cares about the approach.
The approach, right. And those are issues that, of course, I take up in much more detail in the first article on the architecture of jurisprudence.
Are you working on the second right now, or not yet?
Right now, I'm taking
a break. It's a long paper.
I mean, I have in my mind what I'm going to write, but I don't know.
You say it in the last part. You explain what follows from here, but it's going to be a book after.
I hope so.
Right?
I hope so. I have 2 book projects left in my career, I think. But right now I'm finishing I'm going to do 2 things. One is a response to all these papers that people have very kindly written about risks and wrongs. And the other is some big lecture I gave in April on liability and assignability, which is my most recent thinking about issues in torts. Which is, so the thing is, and so those are the 2 papers. Then one is I want to finish the Architecture of Jurisprudence series. I have something I'd like to say about that in a minute. And then I want to write a bigger book, could be short, but a bigger idea, called The Place of Responsibility. Because I think A lot of people can write about the analysis of responsibility, personal and collective, but I'm interested in, and of course I have some things to say about that, probably not particularly original, but I have views about how we can, the conflicting views about the place of responsibility in our moral, political, and legal lives. So I think, you know, you might think that a certain notion of individual responsibility is a core idea in a libertarian's view about political philosophy, and not a substantially important idea in other egalitarian views about political philosophy. Or if it is important, it's important in a different place in the argument. In a different place in the argument. So in libertarianism and political philosophy, the scope of distributive justice is fixed in some way by principle of responsibility. It would be wrong to make me bear the costs collectively for things that I'm not responsible for having brought about. Right? And another view would be, no, that would be a libertarian view, an egalitarian view would be, because it's important that people take responsibility for how their lives go, so that the life that happens to them is something, the life that they live is something that they, as a result of their choice rather than something that happened to them. We have to distribute resources in a way such that what actually happens in a person's life can be attributed to them as they're doing it, so that responsibility is a reason for egalitarianism in the first view, the libertarian view. Responsibility is a reason against egalitarianism, right? So I want to play out that idea in political philosophy and of course in moral philosophy. There are lots of questions about responsibility and related to some of my other interests about the moral significance of time, how it is that the passage of time
moral judgments
affects the moral status of judgments, moral status of what we've done, and the appropriateness of certain kinds of responses to what we've done, and so on. So I wanted to work through all those as best I can.
In legal theory too, or
yes.
planning to include there?
Yes, especially because I have views about statutes of limitations and so on.
No, and also because with time, I think you became to understand the nature of law with some resources that you get from your theory of tort law.
Right.
For example, now in the architecture of jurisprudence, you say that you understand law as a system of moral accountability or
Has
something.
dimensions of moral accountability.
Moral accountability, and that's very private law theorist
view.
Yeah,
right.
Private law theorist view, and it makes sense to distinguish it from system of prices, and I thought that that's very interesting, but I think that is strongly influenced by how you see tort law or your experience in tort law.
Right, exactly. So, you know, I hope that someday I'll bring all these things together. But you know, to be honest, I think in jurisprudence, I don't view myself as one of the really creative people who have a jurisprudential view. You know, I think there are some people who really, not from scratch, because no one does anything from scratch, but who have really developed important standalone jurisprudential views that have to be taken on. I don't view inclusive, as you know, I don't view inclusive legal positivism to be one of those views. I view inclusive legal positivism to be, the phrase I use in the architecture of jurisprudence, somewhat unanchored. It's not anchored, it's just a position in logical space. There's nothing that motivates it at a deeper level. It can be motivated, and if someone were to develop a version of inclusive legal positivism that anchored it with views at a more substantive level about the nature of law.
Yeah, it could be sustained by the more fundamental thesis you display in the paper, for conceptual reasons, for example.
Yeah, exactly. I never did that. So I don't view myself as, for me, inclusive legal positivism was an effort to put something out there that people were inadequately appreciative of. I didn't defend it and anchor it. And I don't view myself as a person who's likely to do that. I believe it can be done, but it just hasn't been done by me. So I don't view myself in my work in jurisprudence as being foundational in that way. So Raz clearly is. He anchors it in a theory about practical reason and the nature of authority. Dworkin clearly is. He anchors it in a view about the nature of agreement and disagreement, controversy, and so on. For me, I didn't anchor inclusive legal positives. And, Shapiro anchors it in the theory of planning and so on, which he picks up from Bradman. So, so his is anchored, and that's perfectly okay. It's less standalone than someone, Raz also has the Razian theory of practical reason. His is anchored all the way down, with original work. So he's the most original. Whatever you think of the work, whatever you think of the arguments, every step in the way, along the way, is a creative, individual, Razian take on everything. And, that may be true of Dworkin as well, maybe to a lesser extent. But
we start to think about Dworkin's contribution to legal theory.
What do I mean?
Yes, because at the time you thought that the critique was not supported, it was not warranted, right? His critique to hard
Right.
positivism. Now when you think about the whole debate, it was useful. My particular view, it was useful for positivism to become better theory.
But you don't.
I don't think it's right, but I can appreciate good philosophical work. I don't know, which is your view?
Oh, I think Dworkin has raised certain issues that are not just about making positivism better. They're really fundamental issues about what we have to agree upon in order for there to be meaningful disagreement, whether meaningful disagreement really requires any form of agreement. There are also methodologically very interesting views that are really, in some interesting way, deeply pragmatist. One of the funny things is I share with Dworkin a deeply Quinian, pragmatist, holistic view of a lot of things. We have to come out differently about what they imply for law. And I don't know a single positivist who shares the same methodology. Right? They're not the conceptual analysis people all the way down and so on. And it's a typical matter. I do think, the issue that I raise as a way of capturing what's going on, not because I invented it, is a deep one that Dworkin is important to contribute to, and that is whether you should see law as continuous with other parts of our social life, or conceive of it primarily as continuous with other parts of our normative or moral life. And of course, as I point out, I think Raz is on that side, and Shapiro is on the other side. And that's one of the ways in which Raz and Dworkin, for me, are similar. Not so much in the methodology, but in their, to understand law, you have to understand its continuities. Any plausible account of law will be an account that displays the continuities between law and what we have moral reason to do. And for others, you think the traditional positivist would be you'd have to be able to explain any plausible theory of law would have to explain the ways in which law is continuous with other aspects of our social life, living together. And of course, I think that's the project that Shapiro is on. So I think, when it comes to Dworkin, he has lots of fundamental contributions that are creative all the way down, and that are not really just about sharpening positivism.
That was not his intent, but
right.
I think that all things considered, I think that positivism can is still a plausible theory.
Oh, I think it's a plausible theory.
And it does not prevent us from making normative theory, just
Right.
in another page.
Yeah, right. Well,
so in that way,
so
but even if I have this position, I can appreciate that if not for working,
you wouldn't have seen it.
Of course.
Yeah. Well, I think there's more to Dworkin than that. I mean, of course, a person who ends up being a positivist at the end of the day is someone who's going to think that they're grateful for Dworkin for helping them sharpen positivism. But for someone like me, who isn't sure what the right view is about anything, I think, thank God for Dworkin, because there's a view out there that probably we never would have come to appreciate or consider in the fullness of time were it not for him. And only time will tell. And what time will tell doesn't really, it won't pick out one or the other. It will just enrich our thinking over long periods of time. One will gain favor maybe in periods of time, but it's the nature of philosophy that things are going to favor and lose favor. So thank God that one is there. So I think his contribution and Raz's contribution to me, I mean, it was hard. There are a lot of people as good, as important as Hart. No one is as clear as Hart. There's Kelsen and others, but no one is as clear as Hart. That was Hart's great virtue. And Hart also, he was not explicit, but he had all these other kind of meta-ethical interests that were part and parcel of it, the expressivism. So those were all there. He wasn't as clear about those. So there was a lot of richness in Hart. But in terms of the sustained arguments, from beginning to end, it's Raz and Dworkin, for me. And the rest of us are just toiling in their field in some way. Sometimes with incredibly interesting things to say. So Mark Greenberg has incredibly interesting things to say, broadly speaking, in the Dworkinian camp. Nikos has interesting things to say, Stavropoulos in the Dworkinian camp. Shapiro has interesting things to say in the more the Hardy than the Razi camp.
I'm not sure.
No, I mean with regard to the continuity of the social.
Yeah.
Marmer has interesting things to say, again, somewhere between the Razi and the Hardy. And I think I have interesting things to say about all of it, in the sense of how to think about all of it, but not about any particular. I mean, at one point I had interesting things to say about inclusive legal positivism, and those things stand, but they're not at the same level. They're not in the same ballpark. Wallachow attempted that. To give a sustained view from beginning to end, which was very interesting, worthwhile. But my contribution is to help people see the whole thing. What's going on at all the different levels, and it's one of the things I think I'm good at, and I don't think a lot of other people are as good at it as I am. I think some people are a lot better than I am at arguing particular parts of it and having a creative view. So, I'll never be in jurisprudence what hard to working or Razi. It's not my skill. It's not where I was interested. It's not what I did. It's not what I have. They have a skill I'll never have. They have a creativity I don't have in this field. I have a kind of creativity of synthesis and appreciating the depth and complexity of the interactions of various positions and so on, that will make all their work more accessible and valuable to other people. That's my contribution. Inclusive legal positivism is not my contribution. Inclusive legal positivism was part and parcel of that contribution. It looked like it was a view of its own, but really it was a way of, when you see all on, here's something they've left out. It was always when you see everything. So from my point of view, my contribution is when you see everything, when you're trying to see what's going on, when you're worried about, is the fundamental question agreement or controversy, or must controversy require agreement, but when you agree, right, that's what you see. When you see authority, does authority preclude the possibility of appeal to morality, right? So I'm all about seeing what the parts are, moving parts, and how they connect. And
different perspectives. It's like
yes.
a three-dimensional picture.
Yeah,
I'm a
the
photographer
of it. Yeah, yeah. I'm an artist of a different kind. I'm not creating a work of art. And some people who are creating works of art, I have to say, I believe, are minor works of art relative to the really great works of art. And the Raz and the Dworkin, they're the major works of art. And many of the minor works of art are really quite good and are very praiseworthy. But they owe everything to what these guys have done. For me, anyway. But when it comes to tort law, I do think of myself, when it comes to corrective justice, as creating a work. And that's why I think, you know, that's where my lasting contribution will be, lasting for academics, you know, 5 years. It's not lasting. But, you know, I think that's my thing.
Okay. Let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
Last one. We have to go to it. What do you think about your philosophical methodology, but as related to all the times you change your mind? One might look at your work and say, he's inconsistent, he doesn't think enough before writing because you change your mind. So I know that's not the case because you have substantive views that sustain for 10 years. It's not the case that you didn't think enough about them for 10 years, but you changed. For example, the Nuremberg thesis is the most significant example. You sustained the Nuremberg thesis for how many years? 10, 12, 14 maybe.
Oh, it's back.
Then you leave it in 92. And now it's back.
Yeah.
Almost 20 years after you abandon it, you are going back to the same idea.
Right.
So I cannot think that you are not thinking enough before writing.
Right.
There must be something else.
Right.
It's not inconsistency either because you're not sustaining different views that are incompatible. Just as
it's an emphasis.
Yeah. So how do you see in the long run or in a perspective now?
Okay.
Retrospectively, I mean.
Okay.
How do you see all those changes?
Well, that's interesting, you know, because the view that I sustained the longest was inclusive legal positivism. It was the one I cared the least about. Right? I sustained it because I was meeting objections to it. So it looked like it's more closely associated with. People think of me, they think of inclusive legal positivism. I do not.
Many people don't know your, in jurisprudence, they don't know your work on torts.
Right.
They skip the whole first part of the practice of principle, for example.
Right.
It's systematically.
Yes.
I know.
Well, the review of it by Dworkin suggests. I mean, one of the most bizarre reviews is Dworkin's review of me, which says, you know, that like all positivists, I don't really care much about the substantive law. He must have been reading a different book because the whole first part of the practice of principle is about substantive. Yeah. Was about substantive area of the law, and like most positivists, I care a lot about the substantive area of the law. So that, you know, that's crazy, but unfortunate, I think. But I have changed my mind. Why have I changed my mind? Because I'm not really so concerned with having a particular view and standing by it and meeting certain objections to it. That was certainly, meeting objections to it was part of what led to inclusive legal positivism being sustained for such a long period of time. When it comes to corrective justice and tort law, I have devoted my career trying to see if I understand what the problems are. So I've been less interested in having a view that gets associated with my name than having a commitment to understanding the problem that gets associated with the name. So the more I learn about different things, the more I'm invited to revisit what I have thought. So part of it is, so there are two parts. One is I've been very lucky in that my work on tort law, corrective justice, has been the subject of a lot of people's attention. And so I've had a lot of feedback by other people about things. When I first started, I did it all on my own. The only other person who worked in a sustained way about it was Ernie Weinrib. And, you know, I found his work extremely interesting, but so different from my own approach that even where we agreed about things, it was for such different reasons. It was not influential on me, even though it was really excellent. It was just not influential on me. But so what was most influential on me was the people who were critical of me, right? And I had so many good critics. So at first, my views changed because I found the criticisms valuable and helpful. Then over time, what happened was I began to see the subject matter differently. So because I was in a law school, had I been in the philosophy department, I may well have had the same view all along. You know, I would have made fine-tuning changes in my views about responsibility or whatever, but I wouldn't have had as much exposure to people who looked at the same problem and were historians or were law and economics people, and inviting you to look at the subject completely differently, right? So now when I look at the subject, right, which I'll talk about today, I look, here's a perfectly plausible thing that never occurred to me before. Why don't I just view torts claims as assets in markets, right? What would be the objection to seeing torts claims as assets in markets? That can be tradable, assignable, waivable, and so on. Well, would that change your view about how you thought about torts? Because if you think about promises, when I make a promise to you to mow your lawn, you can't give that to Jordy, and therefore I'm obligated to Jordy to mow his lawn. So that kind of obligation and right that you have and the obligation I have, they're not assignable in the same way. So they're assets, but their assets are limited. But, okay, our tort assets are limited in the same way. So that's an issue. It never would have occurred to me 30 years ago. Why it occurred to me now is largely a function of discussions I have with students interested in these things. Okay? So if this has an impact on how my views change, I don't feel bad about that. It's not a question of inconsistency. It's about being hit with new information. When you're hit with new information, you should see what difference it makes. So I'm never really thinking about, am I consistently holding on to a position? What's the virtue of that? The question is, am I understanding more deeply the subject? Have I been given information that should cause me to reflect on what I thought about? And how will it's like going to psychotherapy. You go to therapy and hopefully you learn things about yourself, and that alters the way you behave. If you're lucky, it will alter the way you behave. So are you inconsistent because you behave differently from the way you are? No, you're trying to discover more about the problem. You're the problem. You're trying to discover more about it. You're trying to work your way through it. So I don't worry about the inconsistency. Other people make fun of it from time to time, but they don't really understand the project of being an intellectual, you know, from my point of view. And it's, I understand, because there are some people who, and in many ways the best people, they have had, like Raz has been working out what the view is about practical reason forever, and what it entails in a range of different kinds of, and that's unbelievably valuable. That is not me. That's not me. I'm not trying to work out some view I have. I'm trying to figure out what view I should have.
That's an interesting point. Okay.
Thank you
Thanks
very much.
a lot, Jules. Thanks a lot for such a long and interesting interview.
Oh,
thank you.
My pleasure. I hope it wasn't too long. Thank you very much. Thank you.